Hi there.
Hey,
You
so
were
I don't know if you were talking to Deke Barrett or somebody else, but I definitely enjoyed the one I listened to with Gretchen Shea, um,
Oh, cool.
and some of the other what was the artist they were on some LA label.
Oh, Brenna Red, the
Brenna
last
Red.
last gang.
Yeah,
I
I like that music and I like the story and how hard they worked and how they got picked up pretty quickly. Was it Fat Records?
yes, Fat
Yeah,
Wreck. Yeah.
Fat Wreck.
Dickie Barrett wasn't on the show, but we talked about Dickie. I don't think Dickie, I don't know if he would come on my show because I think he
Yeah.
I'm on the other side of his whole
Well, I know you were talking about, the evolution of RFK Jr. and the evolution of punk and, how wild we were in the 80s. We just wanted to piss our parents off and the 70s, late 70s, and wear, whatever crazy insignia we wanted to on our outfits, but then, you know, there was a lot of other stuff going on at the time too. So maybe this new political era will bring about some great music. I mean, I did have a great opportunity to see the Dead Kennedys in New Orleans at a little club, and we certainly know their song, Nazi punks are off. But
yeah,
it was
well,
an interesting conversation to talk about sort of the intermingling of music and punk rock and then even prior to that you brought up feminism, which you very graciously explained to someone. So it was a very nice mix of topics. So nice
yeah,
to meet
that
you.
was a live radio show that we did that you're
Wow.
talking about. It's interesting you brought up how things could go back to the Ronald Reagan years were great years for music
Yeah.
because so many people revolted against him, like the Dead Kennedys and DOA and other bands. So that could happen again, and I hope it does actually.
Well, and there was a whole magazine called Ray Gun
Yes,
in the
exactly.
80s too, right? So
Yeah.
I remember those times. And that's how I got started, like even though I was raised on classical music and hymns because my dad was a preacher. When I left New Orleans Center for Creative Arts, where I went to school with Winton and Branford and Terrence Blanchard and studied jazz and classical, I immediately went into punk rock. Were my first band. So
Yeah, and I want to
uh
talk to you about all that.
sure,
First of all, I
sure.
was going to ask you about New Orleans because I'm fairly familiar with New Orleans. I had a girlfriend there that was from there, and we went out for a while. She's passed away, unfortunately.
No, I'm
Terry
sorry.
Engeron, I don't know if you know her, Terry Engeron. So I went down. She lived in Metairie, which was God,
That's where my mom lives, and yeah, I'm
yeah,
very familiar.
yeah. Metairie and Ken are kind of like kind of a little out of my element especially when I heard David Duke used to be the rep for that area. It's hard to believe.
Well, he wasn't really. He was almost elected. And it's amazing how much support he did get in those areas. As a matter of fact, I remember being at a very small carnival parade, not on Mardi Gras Day, but around that time. And David Duke and his minions walking in this parade, and all of us were just mortified and we were hissing at him. Uh, like, and we didn't want to boo out loud. We didn't know who would beat us up, but gosh, that guy was.
Yeah,
But
but I did like it there. I went there many times, and
yeah,
I've been
yeah,
all
yeah.
over. When you said a small club, I don't know why, but I was thinking about the Howlin' Wolf and Tipitina's and all these cool rooms that I went to. I went to bigger rooms too, but New Orleans, what was it like growing up there for you?
It was really interesting. Like I said, my dad was a minister and my mom was a Cuban immigrant, and we lived in the uptown area, but it was, very wealthy a few blocks this way and very poor a few blocks this way. And we
Yeah.
kind of lived in the middle. Um, but it was very rich. I mean, I didn't have the experience of being exposed to things like jazz clubs because my parents didn't go out to jazz clubs. Neither of them ever drank. Um, and but you did get sort of through osmosis this injection of blues and jazz that you either heard on the streets, people
Mm.
playing in during the parades. Like I said, there were marching bands and stuff. But I did not grow up with that sort of New Orleans experience that a lot of people did because uh, my life was pretty insulated. Like I didn't even really listen to very much pop music until I was probably in high school or after high school when I, you know, started listening to more radio and got into late 70s, early 80s punk and stuff.
So that was the first thing you caught on to was the late set. Was it the English bands or the New York
It
bands
was
or?
definitely New York bands like Ramones, Blondie,
Mhm.
Talking Heads. I mean, I was definitely in junior high school fan of Led Zeppelin and Yes, and some of those prog or proggy rock bands. Um, and ZZ Top and Leonard Skinner back in, got with some exposure to that. But when I really went full bore into it was, after high school when I started getting, we had a very, very good punk band. We would call them punk pop now, but because they weren't like the Dead Kennedys or the Circle Jerks or, you know, uh, but they were called the Normals, and they had a really huge two huge radio hits in New Orleans called Almost Ready and My Hardcore. And they really inspired me because they were just so electric on stage and they wrote great songs with great hooks and they had the whole package. I mean, they were really the equivalent of the Ramones meet the Sex Pistols in New Orleans. They actually, I think they opened for the Sex Pistols in Baton Rouge.
Did you know the Red Rockers?
Absolutely. I
Yeah,
opened for them
I'm
many
good.
times.
Yeah, I'm friends with Darren. Darren's in New
Darren
England
Hill,
now.
yeah.
He's in Providence, and I met John Thomas Griffith a few times. James Singletary I knew in L.A. because he had a bunch of New Orleans people moved to L.A. That's how I met that woman Terry because she had moved there when I moved there. Well, I was living there a little longer, but that was in the late '80s. Yeah, Red Rockers were a very influential band in
Yeah,
your neck of the
they
woods.
they were really interesting because they started off with a very political stance, even though most of them were came from the suburbs. I played a gig with James Singletary just a couple years ago in New Orleans.
Oh wow.
Yeah, and they got big pretty fast because they had it. They had the look. They were all uniform in their presentation, this bad boy snarling kind of, red rocker kind of attitude. And they did something that very few New Orleans bands did at the time is they took a chance, got in the van, left New Orleans, went to the West Coast, got picked up pretty quickly by 415 Records. And then they had that huge MTV hit China. And then sadly, after that, I think the producers or the studios made sort of a mockery of what they initially were, which when they were on 415 Records was amazing, and I loved their sound. My band was very poor. We had these little rickety amps that were constantly coming unplugged and crackling, and they had this big sound. And I think they were also influenced a lot by the Normals.
Dead Heroes was the song that I
Yeah, yeah,
remember
yeah.
was their
Great
first.
song.
And, they ended up moving to Boston. Not all of them. I don't think James went to Boston, but the other guys did. And then that's how I got to know Darren. And I've known him for years.
Yeah,
He
good
managed
guy.
tons of bands.
Yeah, he has.
When did you start playing guitar?
Well, I first started playing piano. My mom was
Piano.
a pianist. My dad was a violinist. My mom has an amazing voice even to this day. And she's in her 80s. And they wouldn't let me play the guitar. I really wanted to play the guitar, but finally, I broke them down. So probably 13 or 14, I picked up a guitar and started teaching myself some chords and even shortly thereafter started writing music, but I didn't master the instrument because I didn't take any lessons, and um, I never became a great guitar player. I became a good enough guitar player to be a solid rhythm player, um, but could never solo. I just didn't have it in my fingers, and I didn't want to. I was too busy singing and performing to get, too into playing the guitar.
Now, I have a timeline here. Timeline, if I'm a little out of order, forgive me. I know about Pop Combo. I imagine you were still in New Orleans when you started that band.
Yeah, well, the first band was RZA. That was like my first seminal,
RZA,
and we
RZA,
did
yeah.
like sort of a combination of performance art and punk because we were just like all over the place, dressing up, jumping around, doing crazy songs. But RZA was actually the band that opened for U2, Iggy Pop, The Replacements, um,
Wow.
and and then later I think Pop Combo opened for RCA also opened for XTC, Ultravox, and then later Pop Combo opened for Gang of Four, Aztec Camera, Marshall Crenshaw, like
Wow.
a whole bunch of stuff. So
Was that all like Tipitinas and places like that?
no, actually the U2 and the Iggy Pop gigs were both on a boat.
Oh,
So in New Orleans, there's these big paddle wheel river boats that
yeah.
would, dock on the edge of the Mississippi River. People would get their tickets, swarm onto the boat. I also opened for Checkered Past on that boat, just remembering them. Um, and then the boat would leave and go down the river for like an hour and a half, 2 hours, and come back. And probably U2 was one of the first big shows we opened for on the boat. I have pictures of that on my website, and there's some articles about it. And then Iggy Pop, and it was a great time. But some of the shows got so rowdy, eventually they stopped disembarking from the dock and just had to stay in place because people were like jumping up and down, and it was a couple of thousand people. So,
They didn't want
but
people to
then
end up
Pop
in the water.
Right. But then Pop Combo, then we did shows at Tipitina's, at Jimmy's Music Club, a place called Jed's, Tupelo's Tavern. I mean, when the replacements came through town, they were touring in a white beat up station wagon, if I recall. And I think Bob was wearing a dress. They were very fucked up and drunk. And they were so loud that the promoter that booked us and booked them, we all had to go outside to listen because it was a small club and it was so loud.
Wow, that's cool. It's really funny how we're going in a circle because Darren Hill ended up being a manager of the replacements, and
Yeah.
he is now. I guess they're gonna. I heard they might be doing some stuff again, so
Wow. That's
which is
amazing.
amazing. But you worked with Ivan Neville?
Ivan Neville produced the first Pop Combo album. And by produce, that means he came in, hung out for a little while in the studio, and said, "That sounds good." But he did get the credit for that. I mean, Ivan and I were buddies, and we used to run around because I lived on Valence Street, and his dad Aaron lived on Valence Street. And when his dad and brother and uncles weren't around, we would go into their rehearsal space and play around with their amps and rock out and stuff. But we haven't really stayed in touch all that much since then.
When did you move to New York?
I moved to New York in 1991, directly from New Orleans, had no idea what I was doing or why. I think I came for a girl, or with a girl. And I said, screw it, I'm moving to New York. New Orleans has never gotten my music because in New Orleans, you were either a New Orleans musician, you played blues and jazz or Dixieland and rock bands. There were very few rock bands that did well, the Red Rockers, Cowboy Mouth, and maybe better than Ezra, who ever did anything outside of New Orleans that weren't traditional New Orleans music. I'm sure I'm forgetting some. So I said, screw it, I'm going to New York. Pulled up, went to a bunch of job interviews because I had to pay some rent. And that was 91. And I got a job at EMI Music Publishing, being a administrative assistant, and learned a lot about the music business during that time that I didn't know. Not all of it good. And then I just started playing in band. My first band here was a rockabilly band, and then ultimately I started Jennifer Convertible.
Yeah, which I'm familiar with. I know you guys formed around 94 and you did it quite a bit. I mean, I was looking at your discography and a couple of EP. I mean, I remember that song Jackie Collins number nine.
Yeah,
It's a good one. Um, and you had a few singles and you got a pretty good buzz going. Now, I think you do a little touring with Jennifer Convertible?
we did a little bit of touring. Like early on, we had a couple of fairly big college hits. Codependency and the Car Song were pretty popular on college radio. And shortly thereafter, we did minimal touring. We went to Boston. Oh, no, sorry, I take that back. We went to Baltimore. We went to Philly. We went and played North by Northeast in Toronto. Um, Not a whole lot of touring. I mean, we were all working full-time jobs. We were past a stage where we could, pick up a gig, go on tour, come back, pick up another gig. We were all fully employed.
So it was more of a part-time thing.
Well, I wouldn't say it was part-time because we rehearsed twice a week, 2 or 3 hours a night, and we played almost every other weekend at Brownies, Luna Lounge, uh, West Beth, uh, the Cooler, different places here
Yeah,
in New York. But our one and only album, Wanna Drag, was produced by Wharton Tears, who
right.
did Helmet and Dinosaur Jr. and the Swans, Sonic Youth, Quicksand, who I loved, still love.
Where were you living in New York City?
I lived all over. I first started in the Upper West Side, like in 109th Street. Really bad time because it was a crack epidemic was around, so you had to be really careful. Then I moved uh, to Hell's Kitchen on between 10th and 11th on 46th Street, I think. And then moved to Brooklyn for a bit. So kind of moved around a good bit. I lived in the West Village for a little while as well on McDougal Street.
Are you still in New York now?
I am. I'm in
Wow, see,
Ridgewood, Queens right now.
I lived on the Lower East Side in the late 80s and I lived in Astoria around the time that you were moved to New York. So I was working for A&M Records in LA and I got
Uh-huh.
transferred to New York and I got a place in Astoria because by that point the rents started to go
Oh my
whoop.
God. Yeah, it got crazy.
So there was was there a period between Jennifer Convertible and Minor Planets where you took a break or something, or were you just doing that the whole time? Because there seems to be a little break in there.
There was a little break. I'm happy and surprised that you noticed. So my first wife decided to go to grad school in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and Jennifer Convertible had broken up, and I was working for Entertainment Weekly doing web stuff at the time, and got laid off. And Jennifer Convertible had broken up. My I got laid off of my job when during the Time Warner AOL merger, so I was in a dark period, and I didn't want to do anything. I was unemployed. I was living in Michigan. I was like, what the hell do I do now? And finally, when I started to get my footing in Michigan, I was able to connect with a few much younger folks, kids, who were in music school, which University of Michigan has a really great music school. And that's when I started, well, it was without Misty that sort of morphed into Minor Planets. And we did a lot of the same pop punk stuff that I was doing, or power pop, I should say, that I was doing here in New York. So it was a transition. But having kids, like I was formally trained musically, that understood slightly more complex song structures or chordal progressions or whatever made a difference in how the music came out, and it was quite good.
How did you end up in Michigan? Because I missed that part where
Oh,
you
sorry. I had gotten laid off, and my first wife got into graduate school in Ann Arbor because she was originally from Detroit or from Michigan. So we just moved there and spent 8 years there.
was it actually in Detroit?
No, we lived in Ann Arbor.
Ann Arbor. Oh, that's
We
a cool
lived we
place.
lived in, right outside of Detroit for a small time with her mom. And then once school started, we moved to Ann Arbor, which is where Iggy Pop was from. And
Yeah, the
yeah,
Blind Pig is in Ann Arbor. That's a
played there
great
many
place.
times.
Yeah, I figured you might have.
Saw the Lemonheads there a couple of times
Oh,
too.
nice,
Yeah.
nice. So you went back to New York when?
2010.
Okay, so Minor Planets actually formed in Michigan.
Yeah. Although we did come and took played a few gigs here in New York, which went pretty well. But then I came back to New York. I started working the teachers union here, and I wanted. It took me a while to again get my footing because I was going through culture shock. The Midwest is a lot different than New York,
Yeah.
and I always loved New York, even though I lived in LA for a while as well when I was in junior high school. Um, So finally, I started Tenterhooks, which was, a very good power pop band that did an EP here in Brooklyn, produced by my buddy James, who's also was the bass player in Jennifer Convertible in the '90s, and then Tenterhooks, and then he's just produced this new album. So I came here in 2010, started Tenterhooks. We did that for several years, and then finally, when I was ready to put out my an album, I said, I've been using band names my whole life. I had RZA, Pop Combo, Jennifer Convertible, Minor Planets. These are my songs. I wrote them. I'm gonna put my name on it. So
Yeah, I think you put there was another pop combo record that came out in 2020. Was that just an old record that you reissued or is that new?
what's interesting about that band, and I should tell you, we're playing in New Orleans on January 5th, which I just found out about today. But there was all these songs we put out this 4 song or 5 song EP with Ivan Neville. Didn't do very well. We did do a showcase here in New York City in the '80s that there was like 13 labels there, and it was supposed to be big. That was supposed to be our big break. Um, and So anyway, we had all these songs that people still love when we started reuniting over the last 10 years. I said, some of these songs are pretty good. We should record them. So we all got together in New Orleans, even though one of them lives in LA and we hadn't played, recorded these songs ever. And it turned out to be a really good record, again, produced by James Bertucci, who lives downstairs. He's my landlord. Um, and it's came out sounding like I wanted us to sound back in the day. And I said, people still love these songs. They're well worth recording. And it came out to be a really good record.
Yeah, I know it's 37 years
Yes.
in
And the thing
between.
about some of those songs are 37, 40 years old, but I think they still stand the test of time because it covers a range from like power pop punk or post punk to like weird avant jazz to just straight out rock and roll. And I was very happy with how these old songs held up over the years.
So you decided to like just be a solo artist or just called the band Lenny Zenith, and that
Right.
was around 2018.
2018, What If the Sun came out and got, probably some of the best reviews I'd gotten for any of my projects. Um, because I was covered in Billboard, I was covered in Out.com, The Advocate, Outward Music, Pop Matters, just, lots of great press for that record, and produced a couple of videos for it, um, and did a lot of promotion. Um, did a record release party, but and then not long after that was the pandemic. Like the band started to fizzle. We weren't, drawing the crowds. A lot of the people that were Jennifer Convertible fans didn't know who Lenny Zenith was, even though it was my band. And Jennifer Convertible had some really big shows here in New York where we packed Luna Lounge and our records were getting college airplay. Um, but it was very hard Also, our friends were getting older and not coming out as much. They had kids. Um, so so in 2018, I did What a Son, then the pandemic hit, and James and I started working on this album like almost 4 years ago, little by little, laying down a track here, a track there, wearing masks in the studio. And what was interesting about this new record is that all of the musicians were elsewhere except for me and James.
Hmm.
So Raphael Gayol, who is Leonard Cohen's drummer, or was Leonard Cohen's drummer for the last 10 years of his life, was in Little Rock. The guitar player was in Austin. He's in a band called Parker Woodland, and it's very good. Um, James and I were here. And then Tommy Mandel, who's keyboard player, has played with like Bryan Adams was his biggest gig, but he's played with
Yeah.
everybody, Bon Jovi, and he's got a bunch of great songs too. And then we brought in a couple of other people, and it just took us a long time to finish it, just because we were doing it on the weekends. We both had to work. It was no longer the days of like we did Jennifer Convertible. We went in one weekend, recorded all the bottoms, did went in a couple of other days and did some overdubs and vocals, and then it was mixed in a weekend.
Now, where is safe? I read that 100% of the proceeds from that release and the majority of all streams, downloads went to organizations fighting for trans causes since 2022, doing the same on the new album, He, Him. Can you talk about that a little bit and what you've gone through and what made you decide to do that?
Sure. I heard you say on an earlier podcast that you had a friend who's, I think, married to a trans woman. I transitioned in the 1970s. So I always performed as a boy or a man. And in 2022, I had a really horrible nightmare that trans people were being rounded up and put on cargo ships off the coast of Guantanamo. So I was, and because I saw this legislation going through and all this anti-trans rhetoric coming out in the media, and I got up and wrote this song. I said, James, we need to produce this and put it out. And that's when I decided I needed to donate 100% of. I raised about $2,000 like in the first week, for various organizations like the Trevor Project, Trans Lifeline, ACLU, and then smaller Equality Ohio, Equality Florida, Rainbow Youth Project. And that's when I decided, I'm just because I have a full time job still. I'm going to donate all of my back catalog and Where Is Safe proceeds to these causes. And with this album, I'm donating a majority of the proceeds. I have to make some money back because it's very expensive to get it mastered. But the song Where It's Safe is very personal because it pretty much tells an autobiographical story of what it was like for me to grow up as a trans kid at 13, 14, and then starting a band, falling in love, and wondering where is safe, not just for me, but for other trans kids coming up behind me.
This is really interesting because I do know a lot of trans people, but it wasn't as open. People weren't as open-minded. Not that they all are now. Back then, you were like way ahead of what's happened now. That must have been really an unbelievable experience.
Yeah, I was very fortunate about it, and it would take us probably another hour to talk about the core of the story, but I was very lucky because my parents realized there was something going on. They took me to doctors at Tulane Medical Center who got it, even though they had very few guidelines at the time. And they said, I'd always been called Lenny, was always my nickname. And they said, Lenny's decided what Lenny's going to be. You can either accept it or not. Now, I'm not saying that they celebrated it or accepted it or were fine with it, but I was fortunate enough to be able to go to Toll Junior High in Glendale as a boy. And then when I went back to New Orleans, I was androgynous enough that I just got to do it and nobody knew. until I was outed in high school and senior in high school, and they asked me not to come back and sent me my diploma in the mail. Um,
Wow.
and even when I started performing live, none of the press in New Orleans ever brought it up, even though I thought nobody knew, but most people knew. I was a little naive, but I was so androgynous that nobody seemed to care. And but a lot of my fans knew, and I didn't know they knew. I was hoping, that I wanted to be celebrated for my music. I didn't want to
Mm,
make my
yeah.
identity a big deal until I had to. And so Jennifer Convertible was really kind of a coded name for the band based on the furniture store here in New York. The album was called Wanna Drag, which could have been, cigarettes or driving or drag. Um, the car song, which was one of our big singles, was all about the transgender experience, but then again coded. So Where Is Safe was probably the most out autobiographical trans song that I've ever put out.
Wow, it's incredible. Him is like a take, and I must have got this from a buyer or something. Take on being transgender and the fact that as a preacher's kid, you spent a lot of time singing hymns. It's largely a collection of songs where I am bidding farewell to the past while reflecting on the promise of the future. That's a quote from you right there.
Yeah, right.
Um, far from being a disjointed collection, is cohesive masterpiece bound together by you, especially ability to meld rock pop. Um, it's really fascinating. I want to ask you about the album artwork. Is there a specific meaning behind the artwork on He Him?
Um, when I was working in New Orleans, I don't know if you were there at the time, there was a great record store called Metronome
Yes, I know it.
on Magazine Street.
Yeah,
And I worked there with a guy named Sean Dunn, who really got me into Jesus and the Mary Chain. And we listened to a lot of music together and with Rich Dana. And Sean Dunn is in the band 5'8" from Athens. And he's an amazing photographer. And I've been a huge fan of his work over the last years. We follow each other online. And I saw this picture. For some reason, it was just very evocative of the primary single, One of Us Should Go, which talks about the desert and being lost in the desert. And the artwork, the photo that he took is called Tempe Hallway. So his band must have been touring, and they were in some funky hotel in Tempe, Arizona, where I have been. And I said, I love this. Can I please use it? Because the colors kind of match the transgender flag. And then he was very, you know, receptive to it. And then I had Mocha Relic do the graphic design.
beautiful. The song One of Us Should Go, there's also a video of it. I've watched the video several times. The song is fantastic pop song. Talk about that track a little bit.
Well, like I said, I was going through a rough time, um, and my marriage at the time was not doing quite well, and it was a very bittersweet moment because I loved and still love this woman, and we had been together for a very long time and tried everything to make it work, but I think it was both time for us to move on. And that's why the song is so powerful to me, and I think a little bit poignant, is when anybody's been in that situation, you come to the realization that one of you has to go,
Yeah.
and that maybe we've overstayed the benefits of this particular relationship in that particular form, even if it takes another form down the way. So um and and then there's the whole idea of being lost in the desert and waking up with a empty whiskey bottle on the table and trying to drive to work with a hangover and having all sorts of swirling thoughts of aliens or police or crows in the desert, vultures in the desert. So it and the video came together like that. It's a lot of reflecting on the past, and then has a little bit of hope in the future because at the end it says hope is the answer falling into light.
Did you do the script for the video as well?
I did a lot of it. A friend of mine here in New York, David Malone, who's also a great songwriter, musician, singer, also happens to be a really good videographer and video editor. So he came over and shot some film of James, the producer, flipping through one of his old sketchbooks and, looking forlorn. And I suggested some clips that we found online um, that we had to pay for. And yeah, so David and I kind of conceived the storyboard together, and David did most of the editing.
Okay, now I imagine that because of I think you're working full time at another company now, right? So there's probably not going to be any touring or anything like that, or is there? You
Well,
said
that's
you're
not
going
that.
to, you did say you were going to New Orleans to do something in January, but that's pop combo, right?
That's pop combo, but I was trying to put together. I have the fortune to have played with some of the best musicians in New Orleans and New York. Um, and so I was trying to put together an album release. That's ship has sailed, and I had a great group of players lined up to rehearse. But it's very expensive because everybody has to get paid. And I would pay them out of my own pocket. But the record and the promotion and the photo shoot and the videos uh are very expensive, right? And you have to have a tremendous amount of album sales. I'm not giving up on that. That may still happen, but what I'm thinking of doing is possibly a sort of solo show where I use portions of the background track overlaid because I like to do a lot of videography and editing myself, where I use a portion of the background tracks through the PA with me playing guitar and singing with overlay of some of the video that I've collected for these songs. So I think that might be a happy uh, medium where I can go on my vacation time, which I work for a union, so I have a pretty good vacation package where I can go and make little treks to like Boston or DC or New Orleans or, and I have a lot of friends in LA too, so I could do that by myself.
I'm sure you've been in music your whole life. I'm sure you've built up a following of people all over the place, and that would make it easy for you to do that, right? Just go out to LA and do some shows.
Exactly. And like I said, I've lived in LA a couple of times. I've played, back in the 90s, I think at Club Lingerie and
I love
I
lingerie. I love that
yeah,
place. I
I
used
think
to
I
go there.
opened for Howard Jones
Wow.
there. Yeah, that was fun. And I did that show solo. So I have a lot of experience doing solo shows, but I'm still working on that aspect of it. So hopefully it'll come together because the songs are good. They're different in that, like my rock bands, just with all humility, were amazing live. We were extraordinarily loud. We were extraordinarily energetic, and the songs were a lot of fun, and people really enjoyed almost all the shows I ever did. Um, and even when Tenterhooks came together in like 2012 or so, 2014, um, people would come out and be like, I can't believe that there's not, 250 people here because y'all are great. You're tight. Every musician was very good. There were harmonies. We had like energy. And there's a video called Helpless, where you can really get a sense of how good the band was live. But it just didn't take off, for I think a lot of reasons. People just don't go out the way they used to in the mid and late 90s.
Some of us, I'm pointing at myself, have gotten older, so we don't go out that much anymore. I started when you did. I moved to LA in like 80, at the end of 83 to work for Enigma Records. That was a long time ago, man, you know?
Where did you live when you first got to LA?
When I first got there, Enigma was located in Torrance in the South Bay. So had some friends that had a couch. I actually didn't get my own couch. It was an L-shaped couch. And my friend Jimmy slept on one side and I slept on the other. That was right on the Hermosa Beach, Lawndale line. But I lived all over LA. That first stint when I was there, I lived in Redondo. I lived in Torrance, Hermosa. Then when went back again, I lived in the Valley. I lived in Studio City, Encino. And then the third time I went back, because working for labels, I was going back and forth. And I ended up in Santa Monica the last time. But I just went there for most of October, and I still love LA, man. A lot of people don't, but I do.
I haven't been back in a long time. I do also love LA. When I went to school there in Glendale, I thought for sure that's where I would live when I grew up until I visited to New York.
Yeah, New
And
York's great too.
for whatever reason, New York just kind of stuck with me more. I just vibed with it more. It was gritty, it was grimy, and my music was getting grittier and grimier at the same time. So,
Did you play in Boston a lot when you were in the New York bands?
not a lot. Actually, I don't think any of the New York bands played. I played it. I heard you talking about the Rat in Boston, which my 80s band did play there, and we stayed in Boston for several days. The Ratskeller, and it was a great scene and a great club, and I have a great affinity for a lot of Boston bands that came out of that 90s era.
Any you want to mention? Because that's a topic I love to talk about.
Well, obviously I was a huge Replacements fan from the 80s. But then, when I heard Juliana Hatfield, Blake Babies, Lemonheads, I was smitten. I wanted to know everything about what was the label? Was it Tang?
Tang, yeah,
Tang.
Tang. Well, the Lemonheads were on Tang. Juliana, I can't remember what label the Blake Babies. Juliana, by the way, I was just hanging out with this guy Chris Anzalone yesterday. He was playing drums on her next record. She's about ready to make like what must be close to the 30th album. She's a
Wow.
absolute machine.
She is a machine, and a guy that I've been working with on a couple of projects, Adam Lassus, started in Boston, I'm pretty sure, and then moved to New York. He produced, I think he produced Juliana. Um, I'm just looking it up.
Yeah, there's been a she went through a period, I think, of 20 years in a row where she had a record come out almost every single year. I mean,
Yeah,
and she just went on tour with the Juliana Three.
right.
They just did that tour. So,
I would have loved to have been able to do that, but particularly because I had some, obvious medical needs. I needed hormones, I needed surgery. I've always had to hold down a full-time job, so I always had to have health insurance, and I just, gravitated to work that would ensure that I had good health insurance, which I worked at EMI, I worked at Polygram, then I worked at Time Warner, and now at the Teachers Union. So that was kind of precluded me from doing touring, the kind of touring I should have done in my 20s when I was working at Kinko's. But yeah,
Is-
Juliana's a great songwriter. I mean, I was a huge fan of that whole sound and still
yeah,
am. I mean, if I ever get a chance to see Evan play live, I'll go see him, and I saw him in Ann Arbor. I've seen him here in New York several times.
he's still at it. They
Yeah.
both are. Before I let you go, is there any new music or like what do you listen to a lot of music? I mean, streaming, records. I mean,
Well, I'll tell you two interesting things. So Jennifer Convertible, which was, pretty popular here in the mid to late 90s in New York. Um, we're actually planning to do a new record of some lost songs, kind of
oh
like
wow.
Pop Combo. So 25 years after the fact, releasing, either an EP or an album of songs that um people seem to have really liked that were just never recorded towards the end of our career. So that's coming up. But personally, I've been listening to and writing a lot of orchestral music because I was
Hmm.
very influenced by classical music growing up. My dad was a violinist. I've always loved classical music, and then I really like Sigur Rós and some of the stuff that Johnny Greenwood's put out. So I've been writing a lot of orchestral pieces with piano and strings.
It's incredible, man.
So yeah, I kind of run the gamut from.
Yeah.
I also have a couple of. I have one Spanish song out because I'm half Cuban. I'm gonna do another Spanish song next year. So I run the gamut from classical to punk to country western, which was the second single, Beards of Gray, which is about all my old bandmates getting older and getting gray. Uh, Punk, and now going back to orchestral pop.
Dude, that is cool. That's cool
But
in my
a
book,
lot of
man.
times when you're a creative person or a musician, some people kind of stick to the same style and people expect something from you like power pop. And if you vary too far, which this album is kind of a pretty significant departure from Minor Planets, Jennifer Convertible, Tenterhooks, there's still elements of it in there. Maybe if you're Rob Halford and you decide to go through a dance phase, you could do that when you've gotten big enough. But I don't want to say unfocused. I'm just extraordinarily varied in my tastes and output.
It's been a real pleasure talking to you,
Same
for
here.
sure.
You have a great history and you follow a lot of you seem to really love and appreciate all kinds of different music and musicians.
I do. It's my life.
Awesome. Very
Thanks a
nice
lot,
to meet you.
Laney. All right.
My pleasure.